Thank you very much, Judy. I can confirm that beeswax wraps are very good. They work incredibly well and are a great alternative to cling film. Just don't put them on anything too hot. They don't work so well then. Thank you so much for the invitation to come and talk with you. As Judy said, I've been privileged to be a public health physician for more years than I like to remember, but from 2013 onwards, I was the Medical Director for Public Health England, Director for Health Protection, mostly working on things like Ebola outbreaks, national infectious disease outbreaks, led the PHE response to Novichok last couple of years, which was interesting, shall we say. But part of my responsibilities, I've been responsible for our environmental hazard work, which Novichok is obviously a part, but I've got more and more interested in wider aspects of the environment. And so I've produced this talk, which I hope will be of interest, which is on the environment and health and what sort of world we want to live in. I was going to start off, if I may, with some old photographs. On the left there is Budleigh Salterton Station. I was brought up near Budleigh Salterton. If anybody knows that area, there used to be some very beautiful railway lines around there. And that's in 1967, and there is somewhere in the attic at home a slide of me and my brother on Budleigh Salterton Station in a jumper lovingly knitted by my grandmother, so it's probably just as well I haven't managed to get the slide, on the last day of train operations. And one of the things, my father was a real enthusiast for railways, but also very committed to the idea of public transport and the importance of public transport. And he saw the railways in the southwest where we lived being closed and decimated, and he thought that was a bad thing. And he made sure that me and my brother rode on any train that was about to be closed, any line that was about to be closed, usually on the last day, sometimes on the last train. So on the right there is Padstow, and somewhere at home I also have a cine film which looks rather embarrassing in January 1967 of me sitting on the driver's lap hooting the horn as the last train went from Padstow into Bodmin Road Station. Now my father was concerned about the impact. He thought that the impact of road transport was having a terrible impact on public transport, and public transport was really important for communities and for people who didn't have access to road transport. We, of course, had a car and drove everywhere in it, as well as most people do and did. But as part of this, he instilled in me the idea that if you're worried about something, you should do something about it. So in his small way, he joined an organisation called Transport 2000. Sorry, I'll try not to bend towards that. It's now called the Campaign for Better Transport, and he worked in the southwest of England to try and improve public transport. And the small success, but I think was quite a significant one, was this. This was in 1976. This was on the railway line between Exeter and Exmouth. It's called the Avocet line. If you ever get a chance to travel it, it's a very beautiful railway line down by the Ex-Estuary. And it was always talked of as being closed. He rode it every day to go to his teaching job in Exeter. And he worked out that there was this rather large marine camp by the railway, and that there was no station there and nobody was using the railway to get to the marine camp. And he persuaded, along with others, the commander of the marine camp and the railway authorities in the southwest to build a station. So he was at least partly responsible for the building of this station, in 1976, which is no mean feat to have a new station at those times when actually railways were still being decimated and so on. It was the era of chlorofluorocarbons, of worries about the ozone layer, and I was constantly concerned and worried by that, and thought it was terribly important, but didn't quite know that I could do anything about it. So it takes a lot to be a Greta Thunberg, I think, as a teenager. But nevertheless, that sort of built in me some thinking about the environment and health. I want to start by giving you a historical example of the importance of understanding the impact of the environment on people's health and on the biology of disease. And the example that I like is this one. This is a guy called Herman Pidew. Herman Pidew was an epidemiologist in Paris in the late 19th century and was working to reduce the problem of TB. and he worked out that TB was rife in areas of Paris that had poor housing and working conditions. Rates had come right down in places where they built those lovely wide boulevards and done some urban regeneration, which was actually done so that the troops could keep the Parisian labour force at bay rather than for health reasons, but it had quite a health impact. But he thought that TB was due to miasma, this idea that somehow noxious gas from rotting organic matter led to the spread of disease. But what he was doing was getting legislative change, or working with the legislature to get legislative change on working conditions and on housing, which of course would have been a very important thing for the problem of TB. At the same time, this guy was around, Robert Koch, and he of course described the tubercle bacillus, a very, very important medical development. And at the time, that proved that tuberculosis was due to the tubercle bacillus. So all those people who were objecting to Herman Pidoux's changes and not wanting his changes in Paris ridiculed him for believing in miasma, and he lost his legislative change. And his legislative change would have actually done more for the cause of TB at the time than almost anything else. The interesting piece that I found, I discovered recently this guy called Edward Trudeau. And Edward Trudeau was a physician in New York State. And he saw this issue about TB, and was it due, obviously the cause was the bacillus, but it's in the impact of the environment. So he did an experiment. He took 15 rabbits. He put 5 rabbits, he inoculated them with TB directly into the lungs and into the neck. And he then put these rabbits in a small cage and put it in a cellar with fetid air, and it was dark. They had very little space for exercise, and for good measure, he slightly underfed them. He took another 5 rabbits and he put them in a similarly dark cage. This one he buried in a pit in the ground so it goes damp from the earth, but he didn't give them TB. And then he got another 5 rabbits and he inoculated them with TB directly into the lungs and into the neck, but released them to roam on an island with lots of fresh air, lots of vegetation, lots of nice things for rabbits to eat. And he came back after 3 months. And what he found was, of the 5 rabbits in the cage, obviously he was feeding them in the meantime, 4 of them were dead, and 1 of them was almost dead, and he did the biopsies, and he killed it and did a post-mortem on it and had looked at it. And he describes rather beautifully the condition of those rabbits. The 5 that were in the damp, dark cage but with no TB, they were all alive, but they were a bit manky. Their coats were not very good, and so on. And he killed those and looked at them and examined them. So they all died in the end, but his experiments showed that they survived. The interesting thing was the 5 on the lovely island, 1 of them died very quickly, died within a month. But the other 4, he describes rather beautifully, he could only catch them with the aid of a gun. And when he cut them up, he discovered that they were loaded with adipose tissue. Their flesh was beautiful and red and lean, almost described as if he was going to cook them and eat them. But he says he could find no evidence of the TB either where it was inoculated or anywhere else. And I think this is a really rather lovely example of the importance of understanding both the biological mechanisms underpinning disease and the impact of the environment on a disease such as this. And of course, Trudeau went on to open a sanatorium. I suspect he might have had a few incentives to get the right outcome from his research, given that he probably earned quite a lot of money from his sanatorium where he treated people with TB for many years. But of course, the open-air treatments for TB were the basis for TB treatment till the 1940s, till antibiotics came along. And if we look at death rates from TB, this is England and Wales from the 1830s on the left-hand side through to the 1970s, we know that for TB at least, the environment probably had a greater impact than almost any of our medical advances in terms of reducing the population's problem with TB. It's not the same with some other diseases like typhoid or others where the medical impact, the medical developments had much greater impact, but for this one, the environment is very significant. And just a final bit on TB, this is our graph of TB rates in England from 1971 to the present day, that tail end of that reduction that you saw in the last graph ended in about 1983, 85 or so. And from then on, we actually saw a recrudescence of the problem of TB. When we started in Public Health England, this was going up and up and up, and we were at the point of having more new cases of TB in England every year than the whole of the US, despite the difference in population. So we put in place a program to make sure that every bit of biomedical information, every bit of evidence was implemented all of the time. At least that was the aim of the program, from appropriate diagnostics to contact tracing and so on. And we've seen a very significant reduction. We've actually had a 40% reduction in TB in the last 9 years or so, at least part of which is due to the program. The interesting bit is, of course, there are some groups for whom the rate of TB is still not coming down. And guess what? Those groups are those in the worst living conditions, homeless people, people in prison, people who are substance misusers, and so on. So the story continues, and we now, of course, need to tackle that. Now, I am going to go on in a minute and talk about a specific environmental hazard, that of air pollution. But first of all, I want to just talk about the science that links deprivation and poor living conditions with ill health. And first of all, that's a persistent finding that we see, and I'll talk about it in a few different ways over the next while. If we understand the causes and the mechanisms by which that link between poor social conditions and ill health is mediated, then it can, of course, help us to direct our actions appropriately. And the first bit of evidence is the direct impact of the social environment in early childhood. I think that's quite striking. This is a graph published by Marmot in his Review of Health Inequalities in 2010 from some work of a guy called Feinstein. And what it shows is it takes children with different levels of innate ability. So here at the age of 22 months, he takes children with low innate ability, so they're not very bright. And these are the brightest children. He just took the two ends of the extreme for the purposes of this graph. And then he looked at how children did in terms of educational attainment according to socioeconomic status. And surprise, surprise, those with high innate ability and high socioeconomic status do well. Those with low socioeconomic status and low innate ability achieve the poorest at the end of that period. This is after the age of 10 or so. But the interesting bit is that high socioeconomic status acts on children with low innate ability, and they end up achieving better than those with high innate ability but with low socioeconomic status. So the social environment is trumping the innate ability for these children. Very interesting fact and very interesting graph. What he then goes on is to look at some of the factors that affect childhood attainment and then sees how they vary by social status. So these are the ones that Marmot quotes in his report. So birth weight, mother suffering from postnatal depression on the top right, children being read to every day at the age of 3, and children having regular bedtimes. And these Marmot describes as some of the factors that affect child development, and of course they vary by social status. So you can begin to see that there's a link between the social environment and children's attainment and some of the factors that may mediate that link. So that's on the sort of social side. If you then go to the more biological mechanisms, here I've got a graph, a study published in the BMJ back in 2001 now, but it just illustrates a very nice point for me. The authors took 7,500 or so women in 1974. They did the same with men and they showed the same thing, but this is a graph for women. And they followed up how many were still alive and what those who died had died of at the end of 1997. And what you see in people in the least deprived fifth of communities, there's a certain number that have died. And what they die of is cardiac disease, respiratory disease, ischemic heart disease, cerebrovascular disease, and so on. If you go to the most deprived communities, the same number have died several years earlier, but they've all died of the same thing. So the causes of death are the same. People die earlier of the same causes in deprived communities. That's a well attested fact. The question, of course, is what mediates that? And there's a couple of studies that I'd like to show you that just help us to get at that. This is really with thanks to the work of Harry Burns, who was the Chief Medical Officer in Scotland until fairly recently, who looked at this. But here's a graph of carotid artery plaques. Okay, so carotid artery plaques looked at in men between the age of 56 and 66. This is a group of people, ultrasound used to identify how many plaques they had. And those in the least deprived, in the dark blue on the left, is the number with more than 2 plaques. The light blue is 1 to 2 plaques. And on the right-hand side, you simply see that there are many more in the most deprived communities with with two or more plaques than in the least deprived communities. The interesting thing is if you then adjust this for cardiovascular risk factors, you still see the difference. So you can adjust for things like atrial fibrillation, hypertension and so on, and you still see the difference. If you adjust for early childhood social experience, things like years spent in education and parental socioeconomic status, that is what accounts for this difference. And that's what this study shows. So very interestingly, that early socioeconomic experience as children has an impact on the number of plaques in people's carotid arteries in later life. Well, okay, that's interesting, but you still haven't answered the question as to how is that actually mediated. And one of the clues seems to be here. We know that inflammatory responses are important in the genesis of atheromatous plaques and then in their breakdown. And here you can look at CRP levels. CRP is a marker of inflammation according to childhood deprivation. And this study was published in 2011. You can look it up. Looked at the marker of childhood deprivation in terms of housing. So this was number of people per room in the home in which the child was brought up. And what you see is persistently higher, persistently higher levels of CRP in those brought up in more overcrowded housing. And of course, CRP is an inflammatory marker, and this is linking childhood deprivation with an inflammatory marker. So you begin to see a pathway that suggests that, in this case overcrowding, but social stress increases the inflammatory pathways activity, and that inflammatory pathway increases the rate of plaque formation, increases the rate of cardiovascular disease, and increases the risk of cardiovascular disease and therefore death and disease. And so the work of Marmot on the childhood deprivation demonstrates a direct social impact, and this work suggests a biological mechanism by which that social impact has its effect. Now, of course, the environment not only has its effect through those routes, it can also have a very direct effect on our health. And I was about to say you'll all remember the London smogs of 1952. You won't, but you'll remember about the London smogs of 1952. 4,000 deaths or so in the southeast of England had led to the Clean Air Acts and the clean-up that went on. Of course, we think it's much improved, and the situation has much improved. This is a graph of many of the air pollutants from 1970 to the present day, where significant reductions in things like sulfur dioxide, PM2.5s, and many others, though ammonia there, which is principally from a farming source, remains quite high. But these numbers are still high. And despite those reductions, you can still see this was the London smog in 1988. I do remember the temperature inversion in the winter of 1988. I was working in a large psychiatric hospital at the time, and it was a particularly eerie place to walk around on a cold December night in the fog with the pollution all over the place. And my wife took this photograph from an office block in the Olympic area of London just 3 weeks ago, and you can see the haze from the air pollution up here. We still have a significant problem. And of course, episodes like the smogs have a significant impact. But what our work from Public Health England and with the Committee on Medical Effects of Air Pollution, which we work with, has shown is that actually the problem isn't just one of bad air days, of smogs and so on, but there's a persistent problem of air pollution and the harm that it causes. So our work suggests that there are between 28 and 36,000 deaths per year due to exposure to man-made air pollution. Now that's a very large number of people. If you think that smoking causes roughly 75,000 deaths per year, no other risk factor that I've looked at comes close to this compared with smoking. So obviously smoking still the highest level, 220 deaths a day. But if you believe this data, and it's very robust, very strong data, there's around half that number per day dying from as a result of air pollution. It's interesting that when I first started looking at this 5-6 years ago, a lot of people said to me, including some very prominent national scientific leaders, said, not sure we really believe the epidemiology is as strong as you're saying it is, so can you have a look at it? Which I did. I looked at it in a lot of detail. And the evidence is a very similar range of evidence to that links smoking with cardiovascular disease and cancer. You know, it is toxicological evidence, it's time series analyses, it's cohort studies, case control studies, and so on. There isn't the volume of it that we've got with smoking, because that goes back much longer, but the strength of the evidence is really quite similar, and I'm very convinced by it at a personal level. The sources are well known. I'm sorry, this is rather a difficult slide to see all the parts to it, but if you look at, say, construction sites and industrial sites, one of the interesting things is construction sites in our cities are one of the only places that you're allowed to use red diesel in the middle of our urban communities, which is quite a significant issue in my view and needs thinking more about. Aircraft and maritime we've got here. Aircraft, our work has suggested actually you can reduce the air pollution from airports by a very significant amount by doing 2 or 3 quite simple things, simple sounding things. I'm sure they're not simple to implement, but electrifying all the ground equipment, moving to single engine taxiing and having slight alteration of jet fuels. There's reasonably good evidence for that, and action needs to be taken there and is being taken there in many cases. Road transport, of course, we know about. 12% of much of our air pollution is road transport. It's actually slightly less than I thought it was, but it's a very significant amount and is amenable to us to do something about. The interesting one for me is domestic. Where's domestic on here? I guess we'll put domestic somewhere over. There we are, domestic. I didn't realise when I started this work that actually 38% of all PM 2.5's emissions are from domestic fuel use. So that's things like domestic fuel, coal, wood-burning stoves, all those sorts of things. So I had a little chat with our comms team and said, I think we need to take on the issue of wood-burning stoves and people having open fires in their homes. And they said, you must be joking. You're never going to get anywhere with that one. But actually, the harm that we cause to ourselves, our families and those around us by open fires and wood-burning is not insignificant. Lots of work going on to reduce emissions from those sources. But when I was brought up, the idea of having an open fire at home was just wouldn't happen because you have the smoke-free zones and the post-London smog issues. So it's an interesting one. So those are the sources. The impacts throughout life are becoming increasingly well understood. Respiratory disease, cardiovascular disease are obvious, aren't they? But also growing evidence of an impact on birth weight, on children's lung development is very clear of the impact. On neurological conditions and some evidence that may be related to things like dementia in later life. Not a huge impact, but definite some developing evidence there, and both cognitive development in young children and cognitive decline in older people that air pollution has an impact on. So that evidence is growing. The other thing about air pollution is it's quite significantly linked to inequalities too. So we know that people who live on busy roads are more exposed to air pollution, and that air pollution is almost certainly not produced by them because they won't be using those busy roads in the same way. Those will mostly be being used by people from less deprived communities driving through their communities. But this study I found was an interesting one. This was about childhood inequalities, and this is a study in London by the London authorities from 2010. And they took all the primary schools in London, over 1,700 of them. They looked at 433 schools which had levels of nitrogen dioxide that exceeded the EU limits in their area, and they found 1,300 where the nitrogen dioxide levels were within EU limits. But of course, those that were in areas that exceeded the EU limits, 82% of those schools were serving deprived communities and children from deprived communities, whereas the other schools it was slightly less than 40. It's just a nice demonstration, I think, of the inequalities associated with air pollution. We were asked back 2 or 3 years ago to do a review for the Secretary of State on the evidence for practical interventions to reduce harm from outdoor air pollution. We were asked to stratify them by their health and economic impact. There actually isn't enough evidence yet to be able to get that precision of evidence, but we were asked to particularly report on actions that local government could take. We included in that national action where national action was appropriate, and we published that review in March of this year. It's a very extensive review. If you're interested in the science of air pollution and its impact on people's health and what you can do about it, it's worth having a look at that. There's about 200 or 300 pages of it, but we've got a tight summary of it too. And essentially we looked at 5 different areas. We looked at industrial, vehicle and fuel things, planning and structural design, agricultural outputs and behavioural interventions. And what we identified, again, you may be able to read some of that, but there are some really practical things that you can do. Underpinning this, there's a set of principles that we need to be sure that we hold on to. One is that you have to tackle pollution from all different pollutants together. There's no point in reducing particulate pollution and allowing nitrogen dioxides to go up at the same time. You have to tackle it all together. Equally, local authorities have to work together to do it. So there's no point in sorting out some of the air pollution in the centre of Nottingham for that only to cause further air pollution in the outskirts of Nottingham and expose more people there. You actually have to work across geographical communities to make sure that you do it well. Local authorities know their own community best. The local authority in Nottingham knows what to do in Nottingham and where its hotspots are. They'll be different from those, say, in somewhere like Southampton, where there's a significant problem of air pollution from the port because the power supplies to ports are not good enough yet for large cruise ships to do anything than sit in port and have their engines running to keep the power supplies in the cruise ships working. That will change gradually with microgeneration and power supplies on quaysides and things, but it's not yet. So local authorities all have a different issue, but underpinning all this, there is a principle that everybody has a part to play, including us as individuals. And so what we talked about here was many of the interventions around reducing access, reducing the use of the more polluting vehicles, moving to less polluting vehicles, but particularly focusing that in highly populated areas, hence the low emission zones and all those sort of things, and restricting access of them. So reduce the numbers, reduce the amount, and restrict access to more populated areas. If you do simple things like widen your streets but put people who are walking and cycling on routes separate from the streets and have green barriers, particularly, you have to be careful what sort of greenery because you don't want to increase allergens and so on, but actually that does quite a significant impact on reducing the exposure of these people. Of course, people who are most exposed are often the people sitting in their cars. So you get parents who insist on driving their children to school because they think that is a cleaner environment for them. Actually got that wrong. There might be other reasons why they want to drive their children to school, but what you end up doing is sitting them in a car and blowing the fumes from the bus in front of you all over your children in the back seat with your heater. It's probably not a very good idea. Used less polluted routes. I used to love cycling along the Marylebone Road just outside Euston Station, if you know that bit of London, but you can expose yourself to much less pollution if you just go 2 roads down and cycle along the quieter streets. So there's another intervention. Industrial intervention is quite interesting. Places, one of the things we've recommended, it hasn't been taken up yet, but we've recommended that local authorities should be able to impose lower target levels on their local industry in areas where pollution is a particular problem. That may or may not get taken up, we will see. But industrial interventions can be very helpful. And of course, there are specific interventions that we recommend around agriculture, around farming, around rail, around maritime, and so on. Underpinning that is a principle that with something like air pollution, as in any harm for people's health, you should stop producing the stuff in the first place as your first priority. Once you've produced it, you should stop it concentrating. So there's some very obvious things about design. If you build an underpass where traffic is going to clog up, you get very high rates of air pollution in that underpass. So you can design your traffic systems to not concentrate pollution. And then advice to individuals to avoid exposure. But the most important thing is to prevent and then mitigate and then avoid. And then you can put in place and see how your interventions work on that. So in terms of prevention, there are technological policy interventions that you can do, emission concentration limits for factories and so on. You can reduce your personal contribution at home by shifting where you can your mode of transport from polluting vehicle to less polluting active transport or less polluting vehicle. We can reduce the demand on more polluting transport, as I said. We can do spatial redesign, reduce polluting activities, increase active transport. There's farming interventions. They're all around prevention, spatial redesign, introducing green barriers, separating people from the pollution. That helps to mitigate, as does keeping the sources of pollution separate, and displacing emissions away from where people are. And then there's the individual things we can do. Now, of course, none of those are that difficult to work out, but there are other things we can do. I came across an interesting quote that if we could get NHS staff across the country to increase their active travel by 3%, that would, you can do the modelling, it would save around £265 million in NHS costs per year. So acting with our workforce is quite an interesting thing that we can do. Things have a direct impact, but things also have an indirect impact on people's health. So taking air pollution, the actions that you might take to reduce the problem and the health harms from air pollution do other things for people, like encouraging them to be more active, and that obviously has a beneficial impact on their physical health and well-being by increasing physical activity. If you increase green space, that has an impact on people's mental well-being, and I'll come on to a bit on that in a minute. So, I then want to just say something about an example where we begin to integrate these. I apologize for this slide, I will explain it, so don't try and read those things, I will explain it. But this is an example of where our actions on air pollution, on active travel, and on social well-being all come together. And this was a study in Bristol where the authors looked at 3 streets, and they took streets according to whether they had light traffic on them. In the middle is medium traffic, and at the bottom is heavy traffic. And each of these lines is not a car journey. This is a social interaction between people living on one side of the street and other people either on the same side or the other side of the street. And what they showed was that in the light traffic street, people were suggesting they had somewhere around 5 friends on that street and 6 acquaintances. I don't have your for you the definition of a friend versus an acquaintance. We can postulate that, but it's all in the paper. If you go to the medium trafficked street, and this is what people say in that street. So a couple of quotes, real sense of community. We look after each other, there's good communication, there's a feeling of togetherness. If you go to the medium traffic street, a real significant reduction in the numbers of social contacts and the meaningful relationships people have with others on the street. And they start saying things like, well, people don't really trust one another like they used to. Or we only know the people who live near us because it's busy. And then if you go to the heavy traffic street, fewer friends and acquaintances still, and people start talking about the traffic down the road being like a mountain range. It cuts you off from people the other side of the road. So it's just a nice study that says what we know, isn't it? That actually, if you live on a heavily trafficked street, it's not very good for your health. And it's not very good for your health from any number of reasons. And of course, if we design our urban spaces so that we separate homes from traffic, then we can improve people's health and their social well-being. I want to just tell you about 3 different studies briefly on the impact of green space and some of these aspects of the environment. Now, of course, green space has a direct impact on reducing air pollution. It's better for cities in heat waves. You get good-sized parks. It helps to keep the place cool and so on. But actually, green space also reduces health inequalities and starts to mitigate the impact of health inequalities. Again, I'll talk you through the slide. If you just look at the top line, this is overall mortality. And the authors of this study, published in 2008, looked at income inequalities. And they looked at 3 different groups of income inequalities. So high-income groups, lower mortality. Low-income groups, higher mortality. What they then did was to produce an index of how good the green space was in a local community. And they categorized the access of people to green space from those with the least access in group 1 to those with the best access to the highest quality green space in group 5. And so this inequality in mortality between high income and low income in places with very little access to green space, you see if you move to somewhere with high access to good quality green space, the inequality is much less. Now, of course, you have to deal with the income inequalities, but your access to green space is actually mitigating against the health harms of deprivation. Just a nice study to demonstrate that fact. This is a study from Lyon in France. And I need to reread it, if I'm honest, to really understand it. But my understanding of it at the moment is that this is an area of Lyon, and the map's essentially the same in each of these 2. These are every area of Lyon. And these are the parts of Lyon where they had high neonatal mortality. And when the authors looked at deprivation and they corrected neonatal mortality rates for the impact of deprivation, it made a partial impact on this difference. But it was only when they corrected for access to green space that they were able to explain the difference in neonatal mortality. So what they were demonstrating is that access to green space for pregnant mothers was making a difference to their chances of neonatal mortality. Now, if that's right, I think that's really interesting. And they talk about some mechanisms by which that happens in a moment, and I'll show you the graph. And the third study I want to show you is green space impact on mental health. And this is essentially, it's a combined analysis, it's a meta-analysis of studies, sorry, I'll leave that side up, of 10 studies in the UK. And they were looking, these were all studies of the impact on mood and self-esteem of physical activity outdoors. And they looked at different types of the natural environment and considered the impacts on different population groups. Again, you can look up the reference. And the outcome that they found, surprise, surprise, exercise in green space significantly improves both self-esteem and mood. Slightly surprisingly to me, they found that the effect was greatest for short duration exercise rather than long duration. I've always, or for several years, been a bit of an endurance exercise person. Perhaps that's why I feel very grotty after a very long bike ride, but actually just the impact of getting out there and being physically active in the outdoors is very important. The presence of water makes it even better. But although the self-esteem and mood improvements are similar, for mood improvements they're slightly greater for men than women, the people who gained most were those people with established mental illness. So those people with established mental illness gained most, even more than the rest of us, from outdoor physical activity. Isn't that interesting? So if we move on from that to what they concluded was that the environment actually provides an important aspect of a health service. The authors of the infant mortality paper looked at 3 different ways in which they postulated that this access to green space was having an impact. The first is the impact on stress, and we talked earlier about the impacts on psychosocial stress of childhood, in this case in maternity, obviously, and that leads to neuroendocrine changes, likely to be inflammatory pathways as well, but deals with things around psychological restoration, reducing anxiety and stress in the mother, and that has a beneficial impact. In the middle, there's a physiological mechanism that exercise in green space improves mental health and reduces risk from cardiovascular and metabolic disease, also has an impact on obesity, which is the behavioural risk they're referring to there, and those have an impact on pregnancy outcomes. And then there's the direct mechanism. So green space has less air pollution, less noise, important microclimate, so there's an impact through there. Those are their postulations as to the mechanism, but I think that's quite a nice description of how green space and then the environment can have an impact on something here. Now there's 2 final issues I want to consider, and then I'll wrap up with some thoughts about where we go from here. The first is, where is the public in their thinking about air pollution and the environment? I think this is relevant to the wider environment. We've been asked continually by DEFRA to do some work to help people change their behaviours and persuade people to change their behaviours around driving and other things. So our social marketing team, our communications team, have done some work with the public to understand what they think. And what they found was that superficial awareness was high. So superficially they knew that air pollution is a bad thing for health. But they don't really understand the evidence. The way I presented 28 to 36,000 deaths per year, they don't get that. So if you can't decide how many, you can't be very good on the evidence. And that feeds cynicism. They think it's for government to act because it's a collective responsibility, not for individuals. And people don't perceive that they have a choice to breathe less polluted air. And they don't perceive that they do perceive that any action they take it'll need them to substantially alter their way of life, the way they drive and use their cars, but they don't really see that as being for their benefit. So if we ask them to change behaviours, what we're really asking them to do in their broad view is to demand a substantial personal sacrifice for some rather unquantified gains likely to be enjoyed by others, not by them. And that's why we find it so difficult to encourage people to change behaviour here. And the possible responses on the right are what their recommendations are that we're now building into some of what we're proposing around our public messaging around air pollution. So make sure that people understand that it is not just a harm to people who've already got respiratory disease on days when the smog is bad, but it's a more widespread problem to that it's got very real harms to our children, that we identify the differences we all can make, not just have this sense of hopelessness, it's all a problem and we can't do anything. And then make sure that as we're asking individuals to change, we're clear about government is doing things, what schools, what hospitals are doing, changing behaviour becomes the norm. And they are still recommending we focus on use of the car from an individual behavioural change perspective, because that's probably the easiest thing to do, particularly idling cars and short journeys, and just gradually change things. So that's where we're at with the public perception. The other issue, of course, I couldn't possibly talk about environment and health and not talk about climate change and Greta Thunberg, who I think is quite a remarkable young woman. The extreme risks that our societies are facing and our whole civilization is facing as a result of climate change. And she did say to the leaders, world leaders, that you cannot simply continue to look away when it's actually politics and the solutions that politics can help us with are absolutely crucial for the future of civilization. And the evidence is clear, and whilst the evidence is clear and the potential impact is extreme, it's clear to, I think, most of us that there's vastly insufficient action being taken globally to address the problem of climate change. And this is the last graph I'm going to show you, which for me is one of the most salutary graphs. This is the carbon dioxide concentrations in the atmosphere over the millennia, sourced from taking samples through ice sheets that have gradually built up over many hundreds of thousands of years. And you can see where there have been ice ages and where there have been melting of the ice sheets and so on. And then you can see the impact of industrialization, our civilization over the last couple of hundred years. So the idea that this isn't a man-made problem is a very not supportable one. So I just want to go back to my original question, what sort of environment do we want to live in? It seems to me that we've got compelling evidence for the impact of the environment on people's health. We can see the impacts of air pollution. We can see the evidence around the positive impacts of green space and the natural environment. We can see and understand some of the impacts of the social environment on people's health and well-being through things like traffic densities, children's attainment and so on. We can understand something about the link with inequalities, and we've got compelling evidence of that impact throughout the life course and some understanding of the mechanisms by which it works. And we've got compelling evidence for climate change, and that without clear, consistent and sustained action by all of us, the planet really does become more and more unsustainable for our future generations. It seems to me that there are two questions for us to address. One is, what do we want the environment to be like? And the second is, how do we change from where we are now in order to achieve it? On the first, I think you can work out some reasonably clear principles. There's two things we put forward in our report back in March. One was a focus on being clean by design. As we design new communities, as we redesign existing communities, as we design new traffic systems, as we design new technologies and so on, we make them clean by design. I still go for walks through newly built housing estates near home where there's no sign of solar panels on the roofs, there's no sign of good walking routes, and I certainly don't see electric car chargers in or outside the buildings that are being built, and yet we clearly need to do that. So that idea of clean by design, I think, is an important one. There are, of course, some excellent examples. I wouldn't say it's all doom and gloom there, but it's not universal. And the other principle that we put forward was to focus on the next generation and to think about how we create an environment that is conducive to good health and social well-being throughout life for the next generation. The idea of somehow a pollution-free generation sounds very attractive, but the sustainability of civilization for our children, grandchildren, and so on. The question for me, I think, is how do we affect change? And it seems to me that there are three different ways that people tend to see these issues. The first is you disagree with the evidence. Air pollution isn't really a problem except for people who've already got asthma or COPD on bad air days. Climate change is a natural phenomenon. It's nothing really to do with human activity, and all of that is really the purview of the sandal-wearing environmentalist. The second reaction I see is that people realise there's a problem. It's a bit of a scary problem, and it doesn't really apply to me in any way. There's nothing I can really do about it. And if it's really scary and there's nothing I'll do about it, I actually prefer not to think about it. And if I do something about it, I'll be disadvantaging myself and my family for some vague benefit for others. So that's the sort of second grouping, and that's largely, I think, where people tend to be at the moment in our thinking as a society on the environment, on health, air pollution and climate change and so on. The third way, which I think is the one we need to get to, is to acknowledge that these are really very real problems. They do affect me, my family, my community. They're not easy to solve, but if we act together, there are practical things that we can do that make a difference. And the way that we need to solve them is by us acting as individuals with our communities, employers acting, local government acting, government, national government, international government acting. Now, we can't make all of that happen all at once, but we can do our bit, and we can advocate for others to do theirs. And I think the principle of we all have a part to play, and we need strong leaders who will focus on this are really important. I just finally conclude with one of the things that I remember as a teacher when I was at school, who said something to me about, look, you might want to change the world, but in reality you can only influence those people who you have contact with, who are around you. But you can do that, and you can advocate with those people who you have contact with. And if we all do that, then we might make a difference. So I guess my ask at the end of this talk is that between us we do what we can to promote these issues about the environment and people's health, and help to create an ever more improving environment for the future of our children and grandchildren's generations. Thank you.